No plates, no tags. Looks like a junkyard project. Then came the line that would hang heavy later. License and registration, or maybe just a good excuse, old-timer. The morning air in Pine Valley carried that familiar stillness, the kind that only small towns seem to hold. It was the kind of quiet that settles over empty sidewalks and dew-covered mailboxes, interrupted only by the hum of an old engine pushing its way through the dawn. Behind the wheel of a weather-beaten Dodge pickup sat Elijah Morgan, 85 years old, and built like the mountains. He was raised near steady, quiet, and stubborn in the best way. The truck groaned as it turned off the gravel lot of the local hardware store. In the bedboards of treated pine shifted slightly secured by faded rope and years of routine. Beneath them, nestled in a toolbox with a broken latch, lay a few bags of concrete mix and a box of rusted screws. Elijah had bought just what he needed. Nothing more, nothing less. He wasn't on a job no one had paid him. He was heading to fix the back steps of Mrs. Lillian Graham's porch, a widow he'd known since her husband died. In Korea, she'd never asked. She never needed to. Because around here, folks like Elijah just showed up. He wore the same flannel jacket he'd worn for years, its cuffs frayed elbows, patched with old denim. His cap, sun-faded and threadbare, bore the faint embroidery of U.S. Army Special Forces. But you'd have to lean in close to read it, and no one ever did. As he made the slow turn onto Birchwood Lane, a sudden flicker of red and blue filled the rearview mirror. Elijah glanced up, easing the truck to the shoulder without hesitation. He didn't panic, didn't mutter a complaint, just shifted into park and rested both hands on the wheel, steady as stone. Two patrol officers approached from behind. They looked young, too young to carry that much confidence on their faces. One circled the truck slowly, tapping the rusted fender with the back of his knuckles. The other chuckled, no plates, no tags. Looks like a junkyard project. Then came the line that would hang heavy later. License and registration. Or maybe just a good excuse, old-timer. Elijah didn't respond right away. He wasn't the type to rush words. When he finally spoke, it was with a voice worn smooth by years of weather, not weakness. "She's mine," he said, "since '73. But they didn't hear the weight in that sentence. They didn't hear what it meant to keep something running that long. Not just a truck, but a life. They saw the wrinkles, the dirt under his nails, the tremor in his left hand. They didn't see the calluses, the scars, the years. So they pulled him out. He didn't fight, didn't raise his voice. Just moved slow the way you move when you've lived long enough to know that people stop listening when you make too much noise. They sat him down on the curb, concrete pressed against his back. His breath stayed calm. A few cars passed by. A man in a suit slowed down to stare. A teenager drove past, phone angled just right, laughing into the lens. Nobody knew who they were looking at. They thought they saw an old man getting written up. What they were really seeing was history being ignored. Elijah said nothing. His silence wasn't weakness. It was control, discipline, and patience. The kind you only learn when you've waited 3 days in the jungle for a helicopter that never came. He didn't need anyone to speak for him. But someone would, and by the time that black SUV arrived, the story would begin to unfold, not just about a man and his truck, but about the assumptions we make, and the respect we forget to show. Elijah sat still on the curb, the weight of the morning sun beginning to gather across his shoulders. He didn't shift, didn't blink much, just rested his weathered hands on his knees and stared at the horizon, where Pine Valley's hills rolled quietly beneath a sky that hadn't changed much since the '60s. Around him, the scene played out like something between a comedy and a mistake, only no one laughing knew just how big that mistake would turn out to be. The officers poked through his truck like boys digging through attic boxes. They didn't understand. They commented on the dents, the rust, the missing trim. They didn't realize each mark told a story, not of where, but of where one dent came from, backing out of a muddy path outside Kandahar. Another from dodging debris while delivering supplies after a mudslide in Guatemala. But to the officers, it was just junk. One of them opened the glove box and pulled out a slim leather wallet cracked at the corners. Inside, it was a single photo, aged to sepia, A group of men in uniform lined up in front of a field tent, with tired eyes and easy smiles. It was Vietnam, though the date was smudged. Behind the photo, folded neatly, was a certificate, Bronze Star, awarded for valor. They didn't even notice. What they did notice was the notebook that slipped from his coat pocket as he sat down. The younger officer picked it up and flipped through the pages. Dozens of names filled each line, some underlined, others marked with tiny stars. Some simply crossed out. "What's this code?" he asked, smirking like it was a game. Elijah looked up briefly, his voice. "Even names of men I served with." The smirk faded for just a second, then returned. They called it in the truck, his name, his license. No warrants, no stolen vehicle report. Nothing exciting. Just an expired tag and a man who didn't look like he belonged behind the wheel of anything more modern than a wheelbarrow. But Elijah wasn't in a hurry. He had nowhere to be that couldn't wait. So he waited like he'd waited before, under foreign skies, with radio silence stretching across the hours. He waited with the calm that comes from knowing some things can't be rushed, and some moments you just have to endure. From the breast pocket of his shirt, he pulled out a scrap of paper, folded and unfolded 100 times. On it, a single number written in his own hand. No name, no label, just numbers. He didn't dial right away. He just looked at it for a long while like someone holding a compass in a forest he hadn't walked in years. The officers leaned against their cruiser, sipping bad coffee, chatting about a fantasy football draft. One kicked the tire on Elijah's truck. The other checked his watch. "He's probably confused," the younger one muttered. "Might not even know what year it is." But Elijah knew exactly what year it was. He knew how many ramps he'd built since spring. He knew that Mrs. Graham's steps were rotting through. He knew the names in his notebook and which ones no longer answered the phone. He knew the country he had served and the peace he was trying to live in. What they didn't know was that the number on that paper wasn't just a contact. It was a lever. And when Elijah finally flipped open his phone and dialed, he didn't say a word of explanation. He just let it ring once. That was enough. Because while the officers thought they were dealing with a tired old man and a busted truck, they were about to find out they'd sat a living legacy on the curb. The quiet didn't last. Roughly 30 minutes after Elijah made that call, if you could even call it that, the atmosphere along Birchwood Lane began to shift. First, it was the hush of wind falling still, then the murmur of onlookers beginning to gather. A few folks who knew Elijah from the hardware store stood at a distance, brows furrowed, unsure of what exactly was going on. No one dared interrupt the scene. Not yet. Then it arrived. A black SUV rolled slowly around the corner, not fast, not loud, just deliberate tinted windows, government plates, no sirens, no fanfare. But somehow its presence made everything around it feel small. The officers straightened up instinctively, brushing crumbs from their shirts and pulling their shoulders back. This wasn't backup. This was something else, entirely. The driver stepped out first, tall and composed, dressed in a plain black suit. Then the passenger door opened, and from it emerged a man whose very posture told the story before his mouth ever opened. 4 stars adorned each shoulder. His hair was silver, his walk precise. He didn't have to raise his voice to command the moment. He took one look at Elijah sitting calmly on the curb and turned his eyes toward the 2 patrolmen. "Which one of you stopped Sergeant First Class Elijah Morgan?" There was a pause, the kind that soaks into the air and makes people forget how to breathe. The younger officer stumbled a step forward. "Sir, we were just following up on a routine vehicle check. Expired registration, possibly unlicensed driver." The general raised one hand. That was all it took. No shouting, no scolding. He walked over slowly, letting the weight of his presence speak for itself. "That man," he said, his voice low but firm, "trained me. He taught me how to lead men when I didn't yet know how to carry the weight of their lives. He carried half my squad out of a swamp in Sumatra after our comms failed. He is the reason I am standing here today." The officers went still. From across the street, someone gasped. Another reached for their phone, lowering it just as quickly out of respect. No one quite knew what they were witnessing, but instinct told them this wasn't something to interrupt. The general turned to Elijah. "Sergeant, permission to help you up." Elijah stood on his own as always. "Permission granted," he said softly. The general offered a small smile. "Of course it is." At that moment, stories began to flow from unexpected corners. A woman in a nurse's uniform spoke up. "Mr. Morgan helped deliver food to my patients when the roads were closed last winter." A man in a baseball cap said, "He patched my roof when I couldn't afford to hire help." The stories kept coming, unscripted, unrehearsed, just truths, finally finding the air they deserved. The officers looked overwhelmed now, like the ground beneath them had shifted without warning. The younger one fidgeted with his radio. The older one just stared at Elijah, seeing him now in a way he hadn't earlier. Not as an old man with rusted tools and a dented truck, but as something greater, something rooted. The general turned back toward the officers, his tone no longer sharp, but measured the way a man speaks when he's not angry, just disappointed. From his coat he produced a slim folder, stamped and sealed. He handed it to the senior officer with quiet finality. "That's Sergeant Morgan's service file. What you're allowed to see, at least. I suggest you read it before your shift ends today." The officer accepted it with both hands, as if it were heavier than it looked. The general didn't stop there. He glanced over at the old Dodge truck parked along the shoulder. That vehicle right there, it carried medical equipment into flooded neighborhoods after Hurricane Emily. No one else could get through. The water was chest high. Elijah didn't ask for permission. He didn't wait for orders. He went. Because that's who he is. He let that settle. That man, he continued, nodding toward Elijah, came out of retirement at 62 to train search and rescue teams when wildfires were swallowing entire towns out. West, half the protocols they still use. They came from him. The younger officer finally managed to speak, his voice thin and uneven. "Sir, we didn't mean any harm. We were just following department procedure." Elijah, who'd been quiet throughout it all, raised one hand gently. "Don't apologize to me, son," he said, eyes soft but steady. "Apologize to the next old man before you assume he's nothing." It wasn't anger, it wasn't bitterness. It was grace. A few feet away the crowd had grown. No one was recording now. No one was laughing. What had started as a minor traffic stop had become something else entirely. A reckoning, not just with one mistake, but with all the quiet stories people overlook every single day. The county sheriff released a formal statement that afternoon, acknowledging the incident and pledging a review of officer training procedures. But for Elijah, none of that mattered much. He refused attention, refused interviews, and he refused the stack of checks that began arriving from across the state. Instead, he directed every penny donated in his name toward building wheelchair ramps for elderly veterans across the county. He hired no crew, bought no banners. He just kept doing what he'd always done, fixing what was broken, one home at a time. Within a week, the town council voted to install a small bronze plaque at the corner of Birchwood and Dale. It bore no picture, no rank, no list of medals, just a single line. "You never know who you're stopping, but you owe them your best." That quiet sentence carried through the community like a hymn. Something changed in Pine Valley, not because people were told to change, but because they were reminded of who they are, of who they've overlooked, of what dignity really looks like. Patrol cadets in training were now handed Elijah's story on their first day, not as a cautionary tale, but as a compass. A way to know what truly matters in a badge, not just authority, but humility, not just order, but understanding. And though Elijah never asked for it, his story had finally found its place, not in history books or medals, but in the way people slowed down when they passed that old truck, in the way they nodded, in the way they remembered the younger officer, the one who had first approached Elijah that morning, with too much confidence and too little awareness, returned to Birchwood Lane a week later. But this time he wasn't in uniform, no badge, no radio, no cruiser, just jeans, a plain shirt, and a pie from the bakery. 2 streets over, he knocked gently on Elijah's porch and waited. Elijah opened the door slowly, wiping his hands on a shop towel. He'd been reinforcing the handrail along the front steps not for himself, but for the next visitor who might need it. The young man stood there awkwardly for a moment before speaking. I wanted to say thank you, and I wanted to say I'm sorry for not seeing what was right in front of me. Elijah didn't make him sweat. He stepped aside and said, "Coffee's fresh, come sit." Inside they talked, or more accurately, the young man listened. He listened as Elijah spoke, about the value of staying calm when others aren't, about what it means to lead without demanding, about the strength it takes to serve quietly long after the uniform comes off. At one point, the young man asked, "Why didn't you get angry with me? You had every right?" Elijah leaned back in his chair, a faint smile on his lips. "Because the world's full of noise, son. But people don't learn from being shouted at. They learn when someone gives them room to listen." From that day on, the young man began showing up regularly at the VFW hall, painting, fixing things, asking questions, earning trust, the old-fashioned way, slowly with effort. The veterans there were skeptical at first, but Elijah's quiet nod was all the endorsement they needed. Months passed, then a year. The plaque on the street corner had dulled under the weather, but no one dared remove it. Elijah kept driving that same old Dodge. It still rattled, still smelled of sawdust and oil, but now when he pulled into a driveway or parked outside the grocery store, people didn't look past him. They stopped. They stepped aside. They offered a hand. The Sheriff's Department eventually added a new course to its academy recognition and respect veterans in our communities. Elijah was invited to speak at the first class. He didn't say much, he never did, but what he said stayed with every recruit who heard it. Service doesn't end when the uniform comes off, and neither should the respect. Years later, when Elijah passed quietly in his sleep at the age of 91, there was no parade, no front-page headline, just a flag folded over the foot of his bed, a few quiet tears, and a community that felt a little smaller without him. But his legacy didn't die. It rolled on in the ramps he'd built, the mines. He'd changed the silence he'd used as a lesson. The young officer who once sat him on a curb now trained new recruits with Elijah's story as the foundation. And in the glove box of that same old truck parked under a tarp beside the house was still that notebook, the one with names, not codes, not ranks, just brothers, and one line written at the very back in Elijah's own hand. Respect first always, because some lives don't need monuments. They just need to be remembered. If this story spoke to something in you, if it reminded you of someone you know, or someone you used to be, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and share your reflections. Your voice might just be the echo someone else needs. And if you believe stories like Elijah's matter, if you believe quiet strength, quiet service, and quiet dignity still have a place in this noisy world, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps us keep these voices alive. And of course, just a simple like goes a long way. Thanks for spending a few minutes with us today. We'll see you in the next one.